Okay, dual credit students, this is the last part of your Chapter 7 lecture. Okay, so I'm recording this right after you guys left. We finished off right here with the association, so I don't think there's any reason to do any more on that. Now, this sort of fatal drift continues. Parliament, again, just rejects the colonist petitions out of hat, barely even considers them. Look, violators of the association, and this is where the colonists begin to sort of ramp up the violence on their end now. Violators of the association, peoples that would break and would go ahead and trade with the British, this is where we get the term tarred and feathered. They are literally going to be dipped in or have tar poured over them and then be rolled in feathers. That's the literal, that did happen. That's not just something that you see on cartoons. That actually does happen, and it's to people who violate the association. Men begin to drill openly and prepare in preparation of hostilities. Again, and this is something that most colonists don't want, especially your loyalists. Loyalists are colonists who stay loyal to Great Britain throughout the conflict. But even your patriots, your so-called patriots, most of them do not want conflict, but they do begin preparing for it at this point. And then in April of 1775 is when you have, and I've got to read this pretty much word for word because my face is going to block part of this. This is where the British commander in Boston is going to send troops to Lexington and Concord to seize stores of gunpowder. British commander in Boston sends troops to Lexington and Concord to seize stores of gunpowder. And that is to keep it out of the hands of the colonists. And this is where the revolution is going to be touched off. They are also under orders to arrest Sam Adams and John Hancock. And at Lexington, Minutemen, which is the term that are used to describe members of the militia who are ready at a minute's notice. They refuse to leave. There are shots fired. 8 Americans are killed. Several more wounded. Redcoats press on to Concord, where they suffer heavy losses. Lexington and Concord are separated by a creek, and there's a lone bridge that goes over that creek, and they are actually, if memory serves correctly, they're stopped at that bridge and are forced to turn back, and Britain now has a war on its hands. Now, to sort of stack up the two sides, the Imperial, meaning the British, and the Americans or the colonists, we are greatly outnumbered and outgunned in this thing. 7.5 million British citizens to 2.5 million colonists to draw from. The money and the Navy, the power of the Navy, is just overwhelming. When you look at the scale, we don't have hardly any monetary wealth, and we have no Navy at all. That's not good when you're going to fight a war. Britain's professional army had about 50,000 men in it. I'm not sure what blanks you guys are missing, but it's about 50,000 men. There's a lot of American militia, but they're very, very poorly trained. They're not well trained at all. King George also, because of his wealth, he can hire professional soldiers or what are called Hessians from Germany. These are about 30,000 professional soldiers from Germany. There are also about 50,000 American loyalists. So you have colonists who are loyal to Great Britain. They are going to fight for the empire, as well as some Native Americans. There were also some weaknesses, though. So the big one is France. France wants to get even with Britain. It's going to take a while for France to really get into the game, so to speak. But France is kind of waiting in the wings, ready to take their shot at the British. And then the line that, again, I don't know what blanks you have. Ireland requires troops to maintain British control. Okay, basically Ireland has been oppressed by the British government for some time, and in order to keep Ireland under control, they also demand quite a few troops from the British to keep them sort of in check. So you can't just take all of your military and put it over in the colonies. The government in London is not very strong at this point. This is where we get into talking about King George and Lord North being a yes man. Excuse me. Lord North being a yes man really weakens the British government. And another thing that sort of gets overlooked is that the British look at this as a civil war. They don't really want to kill Americans. That's something that oftentimes gets overlooked historically as a weakness for the British. The Whigs and the Tories, Lord North's Tories are going to be your more hardliners who believe that this is a war that's being fought for the sovereignty of Britain. The English Whigs actually are sort of a subversive group. They believe that there's a battle for British freedom that is being fought in America. And that's a more complicated sort of thing that we're not going to get into here. But that's something that, as an undercurrent, kind of weakens the British more than we talk about. There's a lot of really difficult things going on with the army too. Again, because the British Empire is so expansive, the generals that you have in America are not the best and the brightest. The soldiers are not. A lot of times, again, you're going to send soldiers over there that are not the best, and maybe even those who have gotten some measure of trouble. Provisions, in other words, supplies, are a lot of times they're scarce. Food is rancid. That just means that it's not any good. They're operating 3,000 miles from home. That's a huge disadvantage because when you're talking about communication between the government and between the army and getting troops over there and getting them where they need to be, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. So there's actually a lot of weakness going on as well. Again, military orders, it takes, a couple of weeks for orders to get across the sea. They are fighting on terrain that is larger than they've ever fought on before. Again, most of your true Brits are from an island. They've never seen anything this large before. You're talking roughly 1,000 by 600 miles. That's unheard of in Britain. They just don't know how to cope with that. They also don't know how to cope with the fact that there's really no cities by their standards. There is no London. There's just not. It's all rural areas. British armies are going to take every city of any size, but because there's just not that many of them, that's really not that much of an advantage when you're talking about the expanse that they have to control. It's certainly an advantage when you talk about being able to control the ins and outs of trade, but in terms of winning a war of attrition, really not doing you a whole lot of good. And the Americans are very, very wise when it says that they trade space for time. What that means is the Americans don't mind giving up these urban centers. They don't even mind giving up a little bit of ground in terms of rural area as long as they can sort of stall. That's the whole point of this war for the Americans, is just stall, make this war long enough and hard enough for the British to fight that they won't want to fight anymore. Now, the Americans, they have a decided leadership advantage. George Washington, Ben Franklin, some of the great names, not just in American history, but really in British society at this point. These would have been very, very well-known individuals. They eventually are going to get foreign aid from France because, again, France is looking for a way to kind of get back at the British for the War of for the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. European officers, a lot of times, their pay is going to be in terms of land. So they're not getting paid hard cash necessarily, and that sort of works to the advantage of the Americans because, again, they're not fighting that well. And then a lot of other European officers, they volunteered to fight for the Americans if they were compensated in some way as well. So, example, the Marquis de Lafayette, he ends up helping not only to secure that aid from France, but he also proves to be quite an effective leader in the field. Now, there are other things. They're fighting a defensive fight. Anytime you're fighting a war, it's easier to fight on the defensive side. They've got food stores. There's a sort of moral advantage because they're fighting for a cause. The biggest thing, though, is the Continental Congress, again, not a legislative body. It's basically a debating society. The rebels are not very well organized. That's the big minus overall. There's other smaller ones that we're going to get into, but that's the big one right off the top. Again, there's not a whole lot of unity among the colonies, other than the fact that for the most part they don't like British policy, but besides that, that's about it. Individual states want to become sovereign. They want to become their own nations. They are going to resist attempts by that first Continental Congress to exercise any power. And there was also some sectional jealousy. And when we talk about sectional jealousy, we're talking about geographically. You're going to find that if you look at the revolution in any detail, you're going to find that a lot of times Southern officers that are passed over for commands become very, very jealous because they don't feel like those from the North are fit for a command post. Also, there's the obvious economic difficulties that we've talked about before. The Continentals, that's what they're going to become known as, the colonists. They print up paper money, and the paper money has little to no value. The colonies are unwilling to donate taxes or to render taxes, and inflation, which was already a problem to begin with, it even becomes worse. So there's a lot of bad stuff going on. A lot of your military supplies, very, very scarce, mainly because England had provided funds and they had provided weapons, and now they're not. The cost of home defense, while it is an easier defense to make, the cost at this point becomes very, very high, very, very quick. Not just in terms of the amount of money it's taking to try, because it doesn't happen a lot of times, to try to pay your soldiers, but to try to feed them as well, to try to arm them. There's not very sufficient stores of gunpowder. There's not cannons, because it's an agricultural economy. There's just not, again, the same thing that was a plus earlier is now a minus. We don't have cities to produce these things on a large scale. Again, lack of military supplies in terms of guns, but also in terms of food. At Valley Forge, there's 3 days without bread during that winter of 1777, 1778. A lot of times men are going to become faint and die where they stand. Everything that you could imagine in terms of logistics is against the Americans, because there's just not any way to provide it, because there's no funds, and because of the blockades, there's no way to really trade for it. So as bad as it was for the British, it's even worse for the Americans. There's a lot of militiamen, but they're very unreliable. George Washington himself is actually quoted as saying that he hated militia. And women actually are going to maintain and play a huge part in the revolution, okay? Because they're going to maintain those farms and businesses while husbands are out fighting the war. There's that as well. I'm going to post this later on my website. I'll post it on Monday because I'm running out of time. That's just kind of, Baron von Steuben is a German who actually comes over here and is instrumental in organization. Blacks are going to fight for the American cause, mainly because there are attempts to give them their freedom. As many as 5,000 are going to enlist eventually. Also served on the British side, again with the promise of freedom. So that's going to sum it up. I'm going to have to cut it off. I think that's about it. So get this watched, and we'll watch the Patriot next week.